I remember that afternoon with agonizing clarity. The afternoon the divorce papers slid across the glass table and stopped right in front of my hands as if I were being handed an invoice rather than the final period to a 3-year marriage. The coffee shop was on the second floor overlooking a grand avenue in the heart of the Upper East Side. Through the large windows the traffic jammed together under the setting sun. Inside the air conditioning hummed at a steady rhythm and the smell of roasted coffee mixed with the sickeningly sweet perfume. Person sitting across from me left a bitter dryness in my throat. To my left was my husband Jason. To his right was Allison, my best friend of 20 years. I sat across from them with my hands resting on my purse, my back straight and my eyes locked on the stack of papers his lawyer had just handed me. The ink from the law firm's certification wasn't even fully dry yet. Everything had been drafted in a concise, clear and ruthlessly cold manner. The Upper West Side apartment, the 3-row SUV we bought last year, the remaining savings in our joint account, even the expensive furniture we had once picked out together with such excitement. It was all meticulously divided into lines of black ink on white paper. The only thing missing was the most important part. Sign it, Catherine. Jason's voice sounded monotonous. It wasn't loud, but it was hard as the glass table separating us. I looked up to meet his eyes. In 3 years of marriage I had heard him use all kinds of tones. Tender, pleading, irritated, even the glacial silence. But I had never heard this tone before. It was like a supervisor urging an employee to sign a delivery receipt just to get it over with. Allison, sitting next to him, had her fingernails painted a bright red resting lightly on the sleeve of Jason's suit jacket. With her head slightly tilted, her voice was so soft that anyone who didn't know the story would think she was trying to console me out of pure compassion. Catherine, you can't force the heart. If your love has run its course, it's better to let it go. What we have is real. I looked at Allison, at that face that had been familiar to me since the 3rd grade. At those lips that had laughed and talked with me so many times in my mother's small kitchen. I looked at those eyes that had once filled with tears as she hugged me when my father was admitted to the hospital. I no longer saw my friend of 20 years. In front of me there was only a woman trying to use a gentle tone to hide the triumph shining deep in her eyes. The cafe wasn't loud, so the nearby tables could definitely hear us. I knew they weren't turning to look directly at us, but their ears were perked up. Their sidelong glances brushed against us and then silently withdrew. Jason, impatient, drummed his fingers on the table. I've already made it very clear. The house is split according to the law. The money right down the middle. I'm not going to let you walk away empty-handed. Making a scene won't do any good. I cast my eyes down at the papers once more. My hands were freezing but my mind was strangely lucid. That lucidity hadn't arrived overnight. It didn't start that afternoon. Not even when I first discovered their betrayal. It started 3 months ago. The day Allison showed up at my door with a cream-colored suitcase. Her eyes bloodshot and her lips trembling, saying she had just broken up with her boyfriend, that she had been kicked out of the apartment they shared, and that she had nowhere to go. That day I was the one who opened the door for her. Stay with us for a few days, I told her as I helped her drag her suitcase inside. That's what friends are for. 3 months later she was sitting across from me, stroking the sleeve of my husband's jacket as if it were a natural gesture deeply rooted in habit. I flipped to the 2nd page, then the 3rd. The clauses remained impeccable. Jason's lawyer was without a doubt a professional. Except he didn't know everything. Or maybe he did and had omitted it on purpose. I placed the papers back on the table. I'm not signing. Jason froze for a couple of seconds. His face paled then darkened. Catherine, don't cross the line. Allison gently squeezed his wrist and turned to me with a voice as soft as cotton. Catherine, think about this carefully. Clinging to someone who doesn't love you anymore will only hurt you both. I let out a laugh. Not a loud one. Just a brief dry sound that even to me felt strange. Now you're hitting me with that cliché. Allison was momentarily speechless. Jason furrowed his brow. Stop talking in riddles. I've made my decision. I know. I replied, looking him dead in the eye. And precisely because you've made your decision, I'm not going to sign this. Jason leaned back in his chair, staring hard at me. I knew exactly what he was thinking. He thought I would cry. That I would beg. That I would remind him of our 3 years of marriage. That I would use our parents to threaten him. He thought I would do everything a betrayed woman typically does, only to eventually sign out of sheer helplessness. But I didn't do any of that. I pulled my phone out of my purse. Jason frowned. "Who are you calling?" I didn't answer. I just dialed the number. On the other end, the phone rang once before someone picked up. A deep, formal male voice resonated speaking. "Go ahead." I stared intently at the two people in front of me and pronounced every word slowly. "Daniel, I need you to come to the coffee shop. Please. I've decided to get a divorce. But from now on I set all the conditions." Allison's hand still resting on Jason's arm stiffened. He leaned forward. "What, Daniel?" I hung up the phone and set it on the table in no rush to answer him. I picked up my glass of water and took a sip. The cold liquid ran down my throat. But inside I felt a dormant fire. 2 weeks ago, I was the one who called Daniel for the first time. It was a Wednesday and Jason was supposed to fly out to Boston for a 3-day business meeting with a client. He had packed his bag the night before. In the morning, I left the apartment for work as usual. Jason, still in bed with his back to me, mumbled a familiar goodbye. I went down to the lobby, waited exactly 15 minutes, and went right back up. My morning meeting had been cancelled at the last minute the night before, but I hadn't told him at the time. I just had a simple thought. It had been a while since we'd given each other a nice surprise. I'd go back early, grab some groceries, and make a nice dinner. If I had given him a heads up, maybe everything would have been different. At the very least, I wouldn't have heard the words that entirely woke me up. I used my key to open the door silently. The apartment was empty except for the bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and from inside came the sound of a woman laughing. Then Jason's voice, and then Allison's. They were broken phrases, but clear enough for me to understand my exact role in their story. A boring wife. A woman who only knew how to work. An idiot who trusted her best friend and her husband. A bridge for them to cross over. I didn't kick the door down. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I stood outside listening to it all. And then I went downstairs and sat on a bench in the courtyard for 3 hours. It was sunny, but my hands were freezing. I don't know what I was staring at. I only remember an elm leaf falling right onto my shoe, and I stared at it for a very long time. Around noon, I called Daniel. He was the corporate attorney who had collaborated with my firm for years, handling mainly civil cases and contracts. To him, I was just a regular project manager, at least on the surface. I asked him to discreetly investigate a few matters. The transaction history of our joint bank account, the purchase contract for the SUV Jason drove, and some documents related to the apartment we lived in. 3 days later, Daniel brought me a thick dossier. I sat in my office turning each page as I felt the cold take over my entire body. The money in our joint savings account had been almost entirely withdrawn in small increments and transferred to a personal account in Jason's name. The 3-row SUV wasn't a company car on loan as he had told me. He paying it off in installments. And the $20,000 down payment had come straight out of our joint account. Over the last 6 months, there had been regular monthly transfers to a woman's name. The memo line sometimes said help, sometimes loan, and sometimes it was left blank. That woman was Allison. And that wasn't all. The apartment we lived in was legally solely in my name. The money to buy it had been a gift from my parents before the wedding. The monthly mortgage was also paid from my personal account. Jason had only been in charge of running the checks to the bank a few times. Over time, he started telling everyone it was a home we had built together. I never made a big deal out of it. I thought that in a life shared together, you didn't need to keep a ledger of those things. Now, I understood that sometimes it's not about competing. It's just that there are people who silently keep score on you day by day. Catherine, Jason's voice pulled me back to the present. I'm asking you one last time. What are you planning to do? I placed both hands on the table, interlacing my fingers so they wouldn't shake. I looked at him, and then at Allison. That's a question I should be asking the two of you. Allison bit her lip, trying to maintain a serene expression. Catherine, Don't complicate things. Let's just keep everything in its place. Yes, everything in its place. I nodded. Well, today, we're going to make everything crystal clear. Right at that moment, the door to the coffee shop opened. A man in his 40s wearing a crisp white shirt and carrying a black leather briefcase walked in, accompanied by a young secretary. He walked briskly, scanning the room until his eyes landed on our table. Jason turned to look, and Allison did the same. I watched their expressions shift almost in unison. Daniel stopped at the table, gave me a slight nod, and then pulled out a chair to sit. The secretary placed a perfectly organized dossier in front of him. Apologies. I'm 5 minutes late, he said. I shook my head softly. You're right on time. Jason looked from Daniel to me, his eyes starting to show unease. For the first time in months, I felt my heart calm down a little, not because the pain had vanished, but because I knew that from this moment on, they no longer controlled the game. Slowly, I dragged the divorce papers back toward me. I flipped to the last page and looked up at the man who had been my husband. You want a divorce? Fine, I said. But before I sign anything, we are going to recalculate every cent, every document, and every pending issue, including the things you think I don't know about. Jason didn't have time to respond. Allison's face had turned as white as paper. And I, sitting perfectly straight, listened to the slow, steady beating of my own heart. It was as if from the ashes of 3 years of resignation, another woman was slowly standing up. As soon as Daniel sat down, the air at the table seemed to lose its oxygen. At the next table, the clinking of a teaspoon against a ceramic mug rang out. The coffee grinder at the counter kept up its constant whir, and the cars continued flowing down Madison Avenue. Yet, in the space separating the four of us, I could clearly hear Allison's breathing start to accelerate. The sweet, refined facade she had tried to maintain had cracked into a small wrinkle near her eyes. Jason, for his part, sat up straighter, his shoulders tense. His hand resting on the edge of the table was no longer drumming, but his index finger twitched in an almost imperceptible rhythm, one that only someone who had lived with him for 3 years would notice. Daniel opened his briefcase and took out a thinner dossier than I expected. I glanced at the edges of the pages marked with colored tabs. Everything highly organized. He didn't speak right away. First, he addressed me with the same professional tone he used at the office. Ms. Catherine, before we begin, allow me to confirm something. I am here at your request, acting as your legal representation to protect your interests in preparing for the divorce proceedings and the review of assets. Is this correct? I nodded. Correct. Only then did Daniel turn to Jason. Polite, but blunt. I am Daniel, the attorney retained by Ms. Catherine. If you have decided that the divorce is irreconcilable, I suggest that from now on all conversations focus strictly on documents, figures, and legal grounds. That will save time for both parties. Jason let out a bitter, silent chuckle. Wow, you really set this up well, Catherine. You're better prepared than I thought. I looked at him. If I hadn't prepared right now, I would have already signed those papers that divide everything in half, even the things that were never yours. Allison beside him shifted slightly and chimed in with her usual syrupy voice. Catherine, don't speak so harshly. Jason just wanted everything to be resolved amicably from the start. I turned to Allison. You sleep together in my house. You spend the money from my marital joint account. And now you dare talk to me about being amicable. Allison's face flushed red, but she quickly slipped back into playing the victim. I know, clears throat. You're angry. If you want to insult me, I'll take it. But feelings don't talk to me about feelings. I cut her off. My voice wasn't loud, but it was enough to shut her up. If this were really about feelings, you wouldn't have needed to take this route. Daniel opened the dossier, pulled out the first document, and placed it in the center of the table. Let's get straight to the point. According to the property deed for the apartment located on the Upper West Side, the sole owner is Ms. Catherine at the time of purchase. The down payment was transferred from an account in the name of Ms. Catherine's parents to her personal account. Subsequently, The entire mortgage payment history shows that the funds came from Ms. Catherine's personal account. Once you're married, one person's money belongs to both. Right? Jason snapped. Daniel's expression didn't change. Funds used in married life can sometimes be difficult to separate. But the law recognizes as separate property those assets whose origin can be clearly proven. In the case of this apartment, the documentation is quite clear. Jason turned to me, his eyes flaring with anger. You hid it from me. I felt a bitter laugh form in my throat. Hid it? You lived in that house for 3 years. You never once asked whose name was on the deed or whose money was paying for it. And now you say I hid it from you. Or is it just that you only care about how much you get to walk away with in the divorce? My words made Jason clench his fists. I knew he was holding back because the coffee shop was full. Because there was a lawyer present. And because he still wanted to keep up appearances. But his face had taken on a grayish tint. The same color he turned the day I showed him the photo of the purchase contract for the car. Daniel pulled out another piece of paper. Next, the vehicle currently operated by Mr. Jason. The purchase agreement is in his name. The $20,000 deposit was transferred from the couple's joint account. However, at that time Ms. Catherine did not sign any document. Nor did she give written consent to convert a marital asset into a private asset in your name. Therefore, the funds from that down payment must be reviewed. Allison began to shift uncomfortably in her seat. Daniel, I think there must be a misunderstanding. Jason uses the SUV for work. He didn't buy it. 2. Daniel turned to her, maintaining his courtesy. Excuse me. I am working with Mr. Jason and Ms. Catherine. You are not an interested party in these proceedings. So I ask that you refrain from making statements on his behalf. The phrase was as soft as it was sharp. And it left Allison speechless. I looked at her and saw her hands clutching the edge of her skirt. The red polish on her nails seemed louder and more grating than ever. Jason took a deep breath and said, struggling to keep his cool. Fine. Let's assume the house isn't split. The car needs to be reviewed. And the savings, according to the law, remain joint assets. Daniel nodded. Exactly. And that is why everything must be calculated correctly. Over the last 7 months, multiple withdrawals have been made from the joint account totaling nearly $50,000. The majority was transferred to your personal account. And from there certain amounts were transferred to a third party, without anyone needing to say her name. Allison knew who the third party was. Her face turned livid. Jason, on the other hand, slammed his hand on the table so hard the water glass vibrated. I loaned money to a friend. What's wrong with that? Allison was going through a hard time. I looked at him slowly. A friend whose friend? A friend of mine who needs my husband to secretly wire her thousands of dollars. A friend of mine who lives in my house, wears my clothes, uses my things, and sleeps with my husband. I paused and looked him dead in the pin eyes. Go on. I'm listening. The cafe fell almost entirely silent. I knew many eyes were fixed on us. But in that moment I no longer felt any shame. I had already swallowed the greatest shame that morning standing outside my own bedroom door. After that, the stares of strangers were just wind. Suddenly, Allison burst into tears. Catherine, please don't say these things in public. I know I did wrong. But it wasn't our intention to hurt you so much. I stared at her for a long time. There are faces you know throughout your entire youth. Faces you think you could recognize even with your eyes closed. But only when they betray you do you understand that what is most familiar can also be the most fake. From the moment you walked into my house with that suitcase, everything was intentional. I said in a low voice. But every word was clear. The only fool was me for taking so long to believe it. Allison opened her mouth to say something. But the words wouldn't come out. Jason instinctively turned toward her. It was a fleeting glance, but enough to see a flash of impatience. They were no longer on the same team united like at the beginning. That's how people who think they hold all the power usually act. The second their weak spot is touched, they start looking at each other with resentment. Daniel closed a section of the dossier. His voice still measured. I will warn you in advance. Mr. Jason. If both parties reach an agreement, everything will be much simpler. But if you insist on this draft intentionally omitting the funds that must be returned or incorrectly declaring assets, Miss Catherine has every right to petition the court for a forensic audit to investigate the money flows, the purpose of the transfers, and the use of marital assets during the marriage. Jason sneered. Are you threatening me? No. Daniel replied. I am simply informing you of the legal consequences if the conflict escalates. Jason fell silent. I watched his Adam's apple bob slightly as he swallowed. He was scared. Not scared of losing me. He had discarded that fear a long time ago. What he feared was losing money, prestige, control of the situation, and possibly other things he was trying to hide even deeper. I knew this because in the dossier Daniel had brought today, aside from the house, the car, and the accounts, there was a section that hadn't been opened yet. A section related to Jason's job, to the project he was planning to take to a rival company, to leverage a better position. Daniel hadn't mentioned it because I didn't want him to yet. There are cards you must keep close to your chest until your opponent believes they've seen everything. Jason remained silent for almost half a minute before speaking, his tone noticeably softer. Catherine, let's go back to the apartment and talk in private. There's no need to make a scene here. Hearing him, I only felt exhaustion. When he and Allison drew up those divorce papers to force me to sign, he hadn't thought about talking in private. When he drained the joint account, he hadn't thought about negotiating. Only now, realizing that I wasn't going to sit back and take it, did he suddenly remember the words marriage and privacy. There is nothing left to talk about in private. I replied. Whatever needs to be said, let's say it here and make it clear. Through the window, the sun had dimmed, casting a honey-colored glow over the asphalt. Suddenly I thought that a sunset is a lot like a marriage. Sometimes from afar, it looks warm, but only when you step into it do you realize the light is actually fading. Daniel pushed the divorce papers back toward Jason. You may keep this draft, but in my professional opinion, it no longer holds any negotiating value. Miss Catherine's side will send you a new proposal in the coming days along with an inventory of assets, the amounts to be reconciled, and specific demands. When you receive it, I highly recommend you read it very carefully. Jason didn't pick up the papers. Allison beside him didn't dare touch his shoulder anymore. Both of them who had started out with an aggressive cornering attitude were now sitting in silence as if the slightest movement could bring everything crashing down before their eyes. I stood up first, resting my hand on the strap of my purse. My palms were still cold, but my legs weren't shaking anymore. Jason, I said, looking down at the man who for 3 years had been my rock, the man I had trusted blindly. This is only the beginning. What you took from me through deceit, I will take back item by item. And what you owe me for your betrayal, you probably won't be able to pay back in a lifetime. With that, I turned around. Daniel stood up to follow me. Just as I reached the stairs, I heard the sound of a chair scraping sharply behind me and Allison's alarmed voice calling out softly, Jason. I didn't turn around. There is affection that once dead is better left without looking back. Looking back only forces you to see its corpse. Stepping out of the coffee shop, the evening wind hit my face crisp and sharp. I stopped for a few seconds under the shade of a maple tree on the sidewalk. Daniel didn't rush me. He simply stood beside me waiting in silence. After a while, he asked very quietly, Are you okay? I watched the stream of passing cars and felt a pang of pain in my chest. But this time, the pain didn't crush me. It felt like a wound that had just been cleaned. It stung to the core, but at least it had stopped festering. I'm okay, I replied. And after a long exhale, I added, but I think this isn't just going to end with a division of assets. Daniel. He turned to look at me and I held his gaze. The stuff related to his job. I said, I'll tell you everything tomorrow. The wind blew again. At the end of the cross street, a florist was busy tying together bouquets of sunflowers. I don't know why, but that image reminded me of my mother. Whenever there was a problem at home, she didn't cry right away. In silence, she would start washing dishes, wiping down the table, or folding a pile of laundry. It seems the women in my family are just wired that way. No matter how much it hurts, we don't allow ourselves to collapse in the middle of the road. I gripped my purse strap tighter and stepped off the curb. I knew that starting tomorrow, I wouldn't just be dealing with a divorce. I would be facing the ugliest side of Jason's personality, a side that had I not discovered it with my own eyes, I probably would have gone to my grave thinking he was just a cheating husband when the truth was far worse. I didn't go straight home that night. I let Daniel take me to his office, a space on the 7th floor of an older building near Central Park. The sky had darkened completely. The yellowish light from the street lamps filtered through the large windows, casting long streaks across the tiled floor. The city was no longer as loud as it had been in the afternoon, but it wasn't quiet enough to lift the weight off a heart. Daniel made me a hot cup of tea, set it in front of me, and sat across from me without rushing, without pressing me with questions. He gave me time to breathe, to sort through the chaos in my head. I held the cup with both hands, feeling the heat slowly spread through my palms. It was a small warmth, but enough to remind me I was still standing. "Daniel," I said after a period of silence, "the stuff related to Jason's job. I want you to look at it." He nodded. "Whenever you're ready." I opened my purse and pulled out a small USB flash drive. I had carried it with me for the past 2 weeks, ever since the day Daniel handed me the first dossier. I hadn't wanted to open it right away because I knew that once I saw what was on it, there would be no going back. "There are files on here that I pulled from his computer," I said. It wasn't like I was purposely snooping. I just wanted to check an old contract and I saw it by accident. Daniel took the drive and plugged it into his laptop. The screen lit up, showing a series of neatly organized folders. He opened an Excel file, then a PDF, and his eyes lingered on some figures. The air in the office grew dense. I didn't need to look to know that what he was reading wasn't something that could be swept under the rug. About 10 minutes later, he looked up. His expression was no longer as serene as it had been in the coffee shop. It was deeper, graver. "Are you certain these files are Jason's?" he asked. "Positive," I replied. "The user account is his, and the emails inside are his work emails." Daniel nodded slowly. "If what is shown here is accurate, the problem is no longer limited to a dispute over marital assets." I looked at him. "What do you mean?" He half closed the laptop as if weighing his words. "There are indications in these files that Jason has been transferring internal project data to a competing firm. It includes budgets, client lists, and highly confidential proprietary information. If your company finds out about this, the consequences will be extremely severe." Hearing it, I felt my heart shrink. Not out of surprise. I had suspected it since I first saw those files. But hearing it confirmed by someone else hurt just like the first time. "I've been at that company for nearly 8 years," I said slowly. "I started as an entry-level employee and worked my way up to project manager. I've treated every project as if it were my own. And he used exactly that to secure a new job somewhere else." Daniel looked at me, his voice softening. "What do you want to do?" I didn't answer right away. I got up and walked over to the window. Down below, the headlights of the cars formed an endless river. There were people rushing home, others still out making a living, and others like me standing at a crossroads, unsure of how many things they had just lost. "I've thought a lot over the past 2 weeks," I said, my eyes still fixed on the street. "If it were just infidelity, I could have signed the papers, split the assets, and made a clean break. A one-time pain and that's it. But this is no longer a private matter between 2 people." Daniel didn't interrupt. He let me finish. "I can't stay quiet," I continued. "Not out of revenge, but because if I keep my mouth shut, the people who trusted me, my co-workers, will suffer the consequences." Saying that, I remembered the main conference room at the company where I had sat countless times defending every plan, every metric. I remembered the colleagues who had pulled all-nighters with me to meet deadlines. And I remembered the way Jason used to put his hand on my shoulder and tell me he was proud of me. It turns out some words aren't said to be kept. They are said to hide the truth. Daniel nodded, his eyes regaining their calm. "If that is your decision, I will help you prepare everything you need." But you have to understand that when this comes to light, it won't stop at a simple warning. There could be an internal corporate audit and potentially legal consequences for him. I understand, I replied. And I accept that. He watched me for a moment longer, then said, then tomorrow, you should meet directly with the executive team at your company and clearly lay out what you have. On my end, I will simultaneously prepare the divorce filing in the most favorable terms for you, including the demand for the funds Jason misappropriated. I walked back to the desk, picked up my teacup, and took a sip. It had cooled halfway, but the bitter taste lingered. Thank you, I said. Daniel shook his head. You don't have to thank me. I'm just doing my job. The hardest part falls on you. I offered a faint smile. I've already survived the hardest part. He didn't ask anything else. Maybe he understood that the hardest part isn't facing the truth, but accepting it. Leaving his office, I took a taxi home. The car pulled up to my familiar apartment building. I sat in the back seat for a few extra seconds before getting out. Night had fully fallen. The hallway was deserted, lit only by harsh, cold fluorescent lights. I unlocked the door with my key. Inside it was pitch black. Their voices. No lights. No familiar smell of a home once shared by two people. I flipped the switch. The space was intact, but strangely alien. The sofa was still there. The dining table, too. Jason's jacket was still draped over a chair, just like always, but the feeling was entirely gone. I walked into the bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, just like the day I stood outside listening, only this time no one was inside. I opened the closet and pulled out a small suitcase. Not to pack up and leave, but to pack up what no longer belonged to me. I folded Jason's clothes piece by piece, placing them in the suitcase without rushing, without pausing, much like my mother used to do whenever she tidied up the house. There are things that seem insignificant, but only when you have to pack them away with your own hands. Do you realize how heavy they truly are? When the suitcase was full, I zipped it shut. The sound echoed dryly in the silent room. I left it in a corner, stared at it for a moment, and turned around. That night I didn't cry. I lay in bed with my eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. In my mind, the image of Allison and the words of Jason were gone. There was only one very clear sensation. It was truly over. But ending isn't the finale. Tomorrow I would walk into my company, not as a betrayed wife, but as someone who had to defend what she had built over 8 years. And I knew that when that door opened, my life would take a different path. One where no one could trample on my trust as easily as before. Outside the window, the sky was beginning to lighten. A new day was arriving just as normally as ever. But for me, it was the start of a different journey. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual. Not because I was in a rush, but because I didn't want to stay in that bed. There are places that once served as a sanctuary, but after a shock, become the most suffocating places on earth. I went to the kitchen, boiled some water, and made myself a coffee like I did every day. The aroma drifted through the quiet apartment, but this time it didn't feel familiar. I used to make 2 mugs every morning. One for me, one for Jason. He liked his coffee black, no sugar, sometimes rushing out. He'd only take 1 sip and leave the rest. I used to pour it down the drain thinking it was just a minor thing. Now standing alone watching the steam rise from my mug, I saw more clearly than ever everything I had overlooked. I didn't finish the coffee. I left it on the counter and went to get dressed. I chose a light grey tailored suit. Simple and sharp. I applied light makeup and pulled my hair back. I looked at myself in the mirror and saw my face. But my eyes were different. There was no more doubt or waiting in them. Only an almost freezing clarity. Before leaving, I stopped by the corner of the bedroom where Jason's suitcase had sat since last night. I looked at it for a moment, then dragged it out to the entryway. I didn't put it out in the hall. I just left it against the wall right where he would see it the second he walked in. There are things that don't need words. Seeing them is enough. I locked the door and stepped into the elevator. In the enclosed space, my reflection was stark in the stainless steel panels. I stood tall gripping my purse and took a deep breath. From this moment on, every step I took wouldn't just be for me, but for everything I had nurtured for years. The car dropped me off in front of the corporate office building at 8:15 a.m. The lobby was bustling as usual. Employees swiping badges, saying their hellos, the beep of the turnstiles. No one knew what I was carrying inside, and I didn't want anyone to know. I took the elevator straight to the 12th floor, the executive suite. Before going in, I paused for a second, adjusted the collar of my jacket, and knocked on the door. "Come in," the VP's voice echoed from inside. I pushed the door open and walked in. There were 3 people in the room: the VP of Operations, the General Counsel, and the VP of Projects. They looked at me with some surprise since I didn't have an appointment, but maintained their professional demeanor. "Catherine, is something wrong?" the VP of Operations asked. I closed the door behind me, walked up to the conference table, set my purse down, and said slowly, "I would like to report a matter regarding the security of one of our projects." The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The General Counsel looked up, her gaze sharpening. "What exactly is this about?" I pulled the flash drive from my purse and placed it on the table. "I suspect there has been an external leak of internal data. The employee involved is Jason." The 3 of them stayed quiet for a few seconds, not because they didn't understand, but because they needed time to process the weight of the accusation. The VP of Operations frowned slightly. "Do you have proof?" "It's all on here," I replied, including the data files, communication logs, and several unreleased documents. The General Counsel picked up the flash drive and plugged it into her laptop. The screen populated with the files. She opened them, skimmed them rapidly, and paused on a client roster. I clearly saw her expression shift from doubt to tension, and finally to absolute gravity. "Catherine, are you certain this data comes from our internal servers?" she asked. "I'm certain," I affirmed. "I manage that project directly. I recognize every single file." The VP of Projects rested his hands on the table, his voice dropping an octave. "If this is true, we're no longer talking about a simple policy violation. This is corporate espionage." I nodded. "I understand." The VP of Operations didn't speak right away. He stared at the screen for a long time before turning to me. "Catherine, be entirely honest. Do you have anything to do with this?" The question didn't surprise me. In corporate America, when a massive breach happens, the person closest to the source data is always the first suspect. "No," I replied directly, "and I came here today specifically to ensure there are no misunderstandings moving forward." He watched me for a few more seconds, then gave a slight nod. "I believe you." Just that one sentence. But I felt a lump form in my throat. Sometimes the trust of others is the only thing keeping you on your feet. The General Counsel shut her laptop screen and turned to the VP. "I recommend we immediately revoke all of Jason's system access and initiate a full forensic IT audit. We need to do this right now." He nodded. "Do it. And keep it strictly confidential." Then he turned back to me. "And you from now on. Any documentation related to this project gets reported directly to me. No intermediaries." "Understood." The meeting wasn't long, but it was enough to set everything in motion. I stood up, thanked them, and left. As the door clicked shut behind me, I let out a long breath. The hallway was still brightly lit. People were walking back and forth. But inside me a piece of the burden had been lifted. I went back to my desk. Everything looked the same. My organized workspace. My monitor on the stack of project binders to the side. My coworkers were still laughing and chatting about work over coffee. No one knew that in just one morning a massive bomb had been uncovered. I sat down, woke up my computer, and saw a new email in my inbox. It was from Jason. The subject line was brief. "We need to talk." I stared at the text for a moment and clicked it open. "Catherine, I just got a notification that my system access has been revoked. What did you do?" I read the message and didn't reply. I closed the email and opened another spreadsheet. There are questions that don't need answers. The person asking them eventually figures it out on their own. Around noon, my cell phone buzzed. Jason's name flashed on the screen. I let it ring until the very end. And then I picked up. "What the hell did you do?" His voice on the other end was panicked, entirely stripped of the calm he had maintained the day before. "My job," I replied. "Are you crazy? Do you have any idea what you're doing?" "I do," I said, my voice steady. "Do you have any idea what you did?" There's silence on the line for a few seconds. And then his tone dropped. "Catherine, one thing is one thing and another is another. Work is work. Personal is personal. You don't mix them." I let out a soft laugh. "You were the one who mixed them first. You leveraged internal company data to buy yourself a better job." Jason couldn't answer right away. I could clearly hear his ragged breathing over the speaker. "Are you trying to ruin me?" he asked. "I'm not ruining anyone," I replied. "I've just stopped covering for you." The line went dead quiet. I knew there were words that once spoken could never be taken back. "I'm coming to the apartment tonight," Jason said after a while. "We have to talk." "There's no need," I replied. "Come get your things. I've already packed them." "Catherine." I hung up. I set the phone face down on my desk and looked out the window. The midday sun wasn't blazing, but its light reflected off the glass facades of the skyscrapers so intensely that I had to squint. In that harsh light, I suddenly saw the path I was taking much more clearly. It wasn't easy. It wasn't light. But it was the only one I could choose if I wanted to salvage whatever was left of myself. That afternoon, the company began moving in silence. Certain people were pulled into private conference rooms. Systems were quietly audited. And Jason's name started being dropped alongside questions that were no longer casual. I didn't participate in any of those conversations. I stayed at my desk doing my job like any other Tuesday. There are processes that once initiated don't require you to stick around and watch. They follow their own inevitable course to the end. At the end of the day, I packed up my things and got ready to leave. Walking past the main boardroom, I noticed the door was cracked open and several executives were still inside. I didn't stop. Stepping out of the building, the sun had already softened. The evening breeze blew lightly, carrying the familiar scent of city dust and radiating asphalt. I walked down the steps feeling a bit lighter than I had that morning. Not because it was all over, but because I knew I had taken the first step without looking back. And I understood that from now on, every subsequent step wouldn't be to defend myself, but to face things head on. That night I got home earlier than usual. Not because I wanted to rest, but because I knew Jason would come not to see me, but to get his stuff. But either way, I wanted to be there. Not to talk, but to close a chapter of my life definitively. The apartment was just as quiet as it had been in the morning. I turned on the lights, dropped my purse on the table, and went straight to the kitchen. I made a simple dinner: grilled salmon, a side salad, and some roasted potatoes. Not because I still wanted to take care of someone, but because I needed a normal routine to keep from falling into the void. Just as the salmon started sizzling in the pan, I heard the front door unlock. The sound was familiar, but this time it brought no sense of anticipation. Jason walked in. He stood in the entryway for a few seconds as if scanning the apartment to see if anything had changed. His eyes stopped on the suitcase sitting by the wall, and then shifted to me in the kitchen. There was no greeting. "You actually did it," he said, his voice heavy. I turned off the burner and turned around. "You see that I did." He walked further in and closed the door behind him. Today, he wasn't wearing a suit, just a button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up and dark slacks. But his polished appearance couldn't hide the obvious exhaustion etched into his face. "The company is investigating me," he said. "I know it. You didn't have to take it this far." "I didn't do anything," I replied. "I just stopped hiding it." Jason smiled bitterly. "You changed really fast." I looked at him, then glanced at the suitcase. "I didn't change. I just see everything clearly now." He went quiet. The air between us wasn't as tense as it had been in the coffee shop, but it was heavier, like a room that had been sealed shut for too long. "Catherine," he said quietly, "can we talk for a minute?" I didn't say no, but I didn't invite him to sit down either. I just stood there facing him, keeping enough distance so we wouldn't touch. "I know I messed up," he said. "I'm not going to justify what happened with Allison. But could you help me out just this once with the work thing? You just have to say it was a misunderstanding. A mix-up with the files. And it'll all be so much less severe. Hearing that, I didn't feel rage. I felt pity. Sadness that even in this moment, he still thought I would slip right back into my old role. The woman who kept her mouth shut to keep the peace. Are you asking me to cover up corporate espionage for you? I asked flatly. I just need more time, he said quickly. I have that offer at the other firm. If this gets out, I lose everything. I mean it. So, you want to walk away with what you stole and leave me to deal with the fallout? Jason frowned. You're being too harsh. I shook my head. I'm just telling the truth. He took a step closer, dropping his voice to a slightly softer, pleading tone. Catherine, despite everything, we were husband and wife. I don't want things to reach a point of no return. I looked at him and saw not an ounce of remorse in his eyes. Only sheer panic. Panic for his career. For his future. For everything he was about to lose. Not for me. You're wrong, I said slowly. Things reached a point of no return long before you even realized it. He froze, then let out a heavy sigh. Then what do you want? I didn't answer immediately. I walked over to the dining table, picked up a stack of papers Daniel had couriered over that afternoon, and slid them in front of him. This is the new draft, I said. Read it. Jason picked it up and flipped through a few pages. The more he read, the darker his face became. The apartment was not to be divided. The SUV deposit had to be returned along with his half of the drained joint account. Every dollar he transferred to Allison had to be accounted for and paid back. He stopped and looked up at me. And you're demanding additional compensation. I'm not demanding it, I replied. I'm just documenting exactly what you took. You're backing me into a corner. I'm just stopping you from taking any more. Jason gripped the papers tightly. Catherine, if you do this, you leave me no way out. I was left with no way out, too, I said. The only difference is that I didn't have a lawyer. I wasn't prepared. And I didn't have anyone on my side. My words silenced him. I saw a flash of pure bewilderment cross his face. It was brief. But it was enough to know that for the first time he understood what it felt like to be cornered completely out of options. And Allison? He asked, his voice dragging. I have nothing to discuss with her, I answered. Anything related to the money is your responsibility. Do you still hate her? I shook my head. No. She just has nothing to do with me anymore. My answer threw him off. Maybe he expected harsher words or at least a display of fury. But by this point, that emotion had already burned out. When something shatters completely, you don't have the energy left to hate. There is only a void. Jason set the papers back on the table and sat down, burying his face in his hands. Snorts, I never thought things would end like this. I looked at him feeling practically nothing. Neither did I. After a while, he looked up. If I sign, will you stop there? I'll handle my end of the divorce, I said. The company's investigation is out of my hands. He smiled bitterly. So, you're just going to let them deal with me? I'm not letting anyone deal with anyone, I replied. You did something. And now you face the consequences. Silence fell once more. Outside the window, it was fully night. The lights in the high-rises across the street flickered on one by one. Jason stood up and walked over to the suitcase. He dragged it into the center of the living room, unzipped it, and looked inside. The clothes were folded impeccably, piece by piece. Nothing missing. Nothing extra. He stood there for a long time, then spoke in a low voice. You packed this thoroughly. You really didn't want me coming back for anything else. I nodded slightly. Yeah. A soft yeah. But it sounded millions of miles away. He zipped it back up and grabbed the handle. When he reached the front door, he stopped with his back to me. Catherine, he said. I didn't respond. I just stood perfectly still. If you ever need help, let me know. I stared at his back, looking at a man I had once trusted with my life, now as foreign as an old acquaintance. I don't need it anymore, I said. The door opened and closed behind him. The click of the deadbolt was faint, but inside me it sounded like a definitive heavy period at the end of a long sentence. I stood motionless in the empty apartment for a long time. There were no footsteps, no voices, no trace of the man who had lived with me for 3 years. It was just me and a long stretching silence. I went back to the kitchen, looked at the cold roasted potatoes, the untouched salmon. I sat down at the table, served myself a small portion, and ate slowly bite by bite. It tasted the same as it always did, but the feeling was entirely different. There was no one left to wait for, no one to share it with, but there was also no one I had to endure. Those small mundane tasks helped keep my mind anchored. The night wore on. I turned off the living room lights, leaving only a dim lamp on in the bedroom. Before getting into bed, I scanned the room one last time. No suitcase, no jacket, no trace of him. I lay down, pulled the covers up, and closed my eyes. I no longer saw Jason's face. I only had one crystal clear feeling. I had walked down a very long road, and I had finally managed to walk off it. Tomorrow everything would continue, but at least starting today, the past wouldn't drag me down with it, and that was enough. The next morning I arrived at the office earlier than usual, not because I had an overwhelming workload, but because I wanted to take the reins of the new day. After everything that had happened, I understood one thing perfectly. If I stopped moving, others would make decisions for me. The building was the same as always. Brightly lit people filtering in and out. But walking into the lobby, I noticed an unmistakable shift in the atmosphere. Something subtle, but glaringly obvious to anyone involved. The glances of a few co-workers lingered on me just a second too long before darting away. No one asked any questions, but I knew the rumors had already begun to circulate. In a corporate environment, no secret stays buried for long. I went straight to my floor. Sitting at my desk, I saw 3 new emails from the legal department and one from the VP. The contents were brief. They needed me to provide more granular details regarding the projects Jason had touched over the last 6 months. I opened each file and answered every question without rushing, without pausing, with absolute precision and thoroughness. There were metrics and dates that I used to know by heart simply to do my job. Now they had become evidence. Every time I typed a line, I felt like I was physically sealing off a part of my past with my own 2 hands. Around 9:30 a.m., the general counsel called me into a small huddle room. She was there with an auditor from internal controls. They didn't beat around the bush. "Catherine," the general counsel said, her tone serious, but not hostile. "We've done a preliminary review. The data you provided holds up. But to be absolutely certain before we move to termination and litigation, we need you to confirm a few specific timelines." I nodded. "Ask whatever you need." The meeting lasted nearly an hour. Every detail was scrutinized, every file cross-referenced. Sometimes they asked the same question in different ways just to verify my consistency. I understood it was standard procedure. When we finished, the general counsel looked at me for a moment. "I know this isn't easy for you, but you did the right thing." I didn't say anything. I just gave a small nod. There are words that even if spoken lightly are enough to help you stand a little taller. Leaving the conference room, I went back to my desk. My team was still working, but the vibe had fundamentally changed. Some looked at me with caution, others with burning curiosity, and a few with quiet respect. I didn't blame them. When a bomb drops, people tend to watch from a safe distance before deciding where to stand. At noon, I received a text from an unsaved number. "Catherine, it's Allison. Can we meet for a minute?" I stared at the text message for a long time. Seeing her name on the screen dragged up a chain of memories. From our childhood days to shared dinners, the times we traded secrets about our families and careers, and the day she showed up at my door with her suitcase. I didn't answer right away. I put the phone down and kept working. But about 10 minutes later, a second message came through. "I know you don't want to see me, but there are things I need to explain to you." I looked at the screen again, not because I wanted to hear her voice, but because I understood that there are things that if left unsaid will just hang there unresolved forever. I typed back 3 p.m. The usual coffee shop. She replied almost instantly. "Okay. That afternoon, I left the office right on time. I didn't overthink it on the walk over. There are encounters you don't need to prepare for. You just have to bring your clarity with you. The coffee shop was the same one from the other day. The same table. The same window overlooking Madison Avenue. The same afternoon light spilling across the wood. The only difference was that Jason wasn't there. Allison had already arrived. She sat with her back ramrod straight, her hands folded in her lap, her expression strained. When she saw me walk in, she stood up instinctively. "Catherine," she said softly. I nodded and sat down across from her. A silence stretched for several seconds. A barista approached. I ordered a glass of water. Allison ordered a coffee, but when they brought it, she didn't touch it. "I am so sorry, Catherine," she said, her voice weak. I didn't react. I looked out the window where the traffic kept flowing, and then turned back to her. "What did you want to tell me?" Allison bit her lip, her eyes brimming with red. "I know I messed up. I have no excuse. But I don't want you to think I was like this from the beginning." "From what beginning?" I asked. "Since I moved in with you guys," she said quickly. "At first I swear I only saw it as a temporary place to crash. I had absolutely no intentions with Jason." I looked at her, letting her talk. "But then we started talking more. He would complain to me about you. About how busy you were at the firm. How little you cared about keeping up the apartment. And I saw how lonely he was." Hearing her, I felt a chill. Not of heartbreak, but of disgust. Those excuses were so deeply familiar, so agonizingly cliché, that literally anyone could use them to justify awful behavior. "He was lonely?" I asked. Allison shook her head, tears finally spilling over. "I didn't know it was wrong. But in that moment I just couldn't stop." "You couldn't? Or you didn't want to?" I pressed. She went completely silent. I sighed softly. "Do you know what I truly can't accept? It's not that you and Jason are sleeping together. It's the way you inserted yourself into my life, treating me like a sister, all while you were doing that behind my back." Allison bowed her head, her shoulders shaking. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. And I have no intention of forgiving you," I stated flatly. She looked up, her eyes puffy and red. "Then why did you even come today?" "To close this once and for all," I answered. "So that if we ever cross paths by accident in the city, I don't have to avoid you. And I don't have to carry any of this with me." Allison stared at me with an expression of shock that slowly melted into profound sadness. "You're stronger than I thought." "I'm not strong," I said. "I just don't want to be weak anymore." Another silence. The clinking of a teaspoon from the adjacent table rang out crisp and clear. Did he say anything to you?" Allison asked hesitantly. "Yes," I replied. "He wanted me to help cover up his corporate theft from the company." Allison froze. "He actually asked you that?" "I have no reason to lie to you." She sat completely still as if a terrible realization had just dawned on her. "I didn't know." "I believe you," I said. "Because if you knew, you probably wouldn't be sitting here asking me." Allison offered a pathetic sad smile. "Maybe I thought he was different. We both thought that at some point," I replied. That sentence left us both in silence. Not because there were no more words, but because everything that needed to be said had been said. I stood up first. "I'm leaving." Allison stood up as well. "Catherine, truly, I am so sorry." I looked at her one last time. Her face was still the one I had known since childhood, but everything inside it had changed. "I heard you," I said, "but keep that apology for yourself." With that, I turned around and walked out of the coffee shop. The late afternoon wind blew, bringing the brisk chill of the end of the day. I walked down the steps slowly, my heart significantly lighter than before. There are encounters that don't bring you joy, but they help you drop the dead weight. And for me, that was more than enough. I didn't head straight back to the Upper West Side. I took a long walk by the Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis Reservoir in Central Park. The city skyline was lighting up, and the glow from the street lamps reflected on the water like scattered fragments of memories. A soft damp breeze cooled my mind after such an exhausting day. The meeting with Allison hadn't completely cured me, but I no longer felt suffocated. There are things that once you hear them with your own ears and see them with your own eyes, you no longer have to waste energy imagining. And when you stop imagining, the pain recedes. I stopped by the wrought iron fence, staring out over the water. In that moment, I thought of my mother. I hadn't told her anything from the beginning, not to hide it from her, but because I needed to survive the initial impact on my own. But now that the dust was settling, I knew I couldn't keep quiet anymore. I pulled out my phone and dialed her number. It rang twice before she answered. Catherine. Her voice sounded as warm and steady as ever. Hey Mom. It's me. You've been so busy lately. I called you a few times and you didn't pick up. I squeezed the phone. Yeah. I've had a lot going on. My mother was quiet for a moment, then asked, her tone softening. Is something wrong? Honey? That question put a lump right back in my throat. I stared at the reservoir, forcing my voice to remain steady. Mom. Jason and I are getting a divorce. There was silence on the other end. Not of shock, but the silence of someone trying to process. What happened? Sweetie? She asked, not raising her voice. I didn't tell her everything. I didn't mention Allison or what I had heard and seen or the corporate espionage. I just said it as concisely as possible. He's with someone else. My mom sighed a very faint sound. I see. Just those 2 words. But I heard so much in them. No dramatics. No scolding. Just a sorrowful acceptance. Are you okay? She asked. I smiled a little even though she couldn't see me. I'm okay. Are you really okay? She insisted. I stayed quiet for a second before saying I'm starting to be. She didn't press for messy details. She simply said, if you're too exhausted, come home for a few days. That sentence made my eyes well up with heat. I looked out over the water and saw my own reflection blurred among the city lights. Okay. I'll figure out my schedule and come visit. I replied. All right. And whatever it is, talk to me about it. Don't keep it all bottled up inside. I will. Bye. Mom. I hung up and stood there a little while longer before turning back to the street. That night I slept better than I had in weeks. Not because everything was entirely resolved, but because I wasn't carrying it entirely on my own anymore. The next morning I arrived at the office just like any other day. But the second I walked into the lobby, the shift was undeniable. It wasn't just curious glances anymore. This time there were actual whispers. I walked past 2 receptionists and caught a snippet. They say he's suspended over a data breach and his wife works right upstairs. I didn't stop walking. I got in the elevator and pressed the button for my floor. In the enclosed space, I watched the digital numbers climb, but my heart wasn't racing like it had been the day before. The news was out. When I got to my desk, a coworker I was close with came over. Catherine, she whispered. I stopped organizing my desk. Yeah. She looked over her shoulder and lowered her voice. Jason got called into the executive suite first thing this morning. They're saying he's been suspended pending an investigation. I nodded. Yeah. I know. She looked at me with genuine concern. Are you okay? I'm okay. I said. She didn't pry any further. She just gave my arm a supportive squeeze and went back to her cubicle. I sat down, turned on my monitor, and saw a new company-wide email. It was an internal memo. Extremely brief. Please be advised that Jason, an employee in the projects division, has been temporarily suspended from his duties pending an internal review. No details, no explanations, but for everyone on the floor it was more than enough. I read the email and closed it. I felt neither satisfaction nor pity. It was just one more domino falling in the chain of events that had already been set in motion. Right around lunchtime, my phone rang again. This time, it was my mother-in-law. I stared at the caller ID, hesitated for a few seconds, and answered. Hello, Catherine. Her voice wasn't warm like it usually was. It was rushed and anxious. Jason just told me about you too. What on earth is going on? I stood up and walked out to the hallway to speak privately. We're getting a divorce. Divorce? What divorce? She spoke rapidly. Every marriage has problems. But you fix things by talking. Why are you taking it to this extreme? Take a breath. This can't be fixed. If Jason did something wrong, I'll talk to him myself. I will set him straight. But you have to think about the family. I paused for a second and then said, I've already done a lot of thinking. She didn't stop. I also heard you caused a massive issue with his job. You're destroying him. That sentence froze me in my tracks. I'm not destroying anyone, I said slowly. I just stopped covering up what he was doing. But he's your husband, she cried, her voice rising. You're supposed to protect him. We won't be husband and wife for much longer, I replied. Silence fell on the other end. Then her voice softened slightly, though it remained incredibly tense. Catherine, I know you're a capable woman and you make your own money. But being a family isn't just about who is right and who is wrong. Sometimes you just have to let things go. Hearing her, I felt a deep emptiness. I used to love my mother-in-law. She wasn't a difficult or highly critical woman. She used to defend me even more than she defended Jason. But in that moment, I realized that her defense only existed while the waters were calm. When the ship starts sinking, people always side with their own blood. I understand that, I said, but there are things I cannot let go. She sighed. So, what do you want? We are going to handle things exactly by the law, I replied. I don't want to discuss the rest of it. There were no more arguments from her end. After a long pause, she simply said, have it your way. The call ended. I stood in the hallway for a moment, then walked back to my desk. Everything around me was proceeding as normal. But inside, the final thread tying me to that family had snapped. There were no attachments left. That afternoon, I got a text from Daniel. Jason's counsel wants to meet tomorrow afternoon to finalize the settlement. Does that work for you? I read the text and typed a quick reply. Yes. I put the phone down and looked out the window. The late afternoon light was bathing the skyscrapers across the street, just like it had on all the previous days. But the Catherine sitting there today was no longer the same person. I knew tomorrow's meeting wouldn't be a walk in the park. When a person is cornered, they fight tooth and nail to save whatever scraps they have left. But this time, I wasn't the one backed into a corner. And I had absolutely no intention of backing down. The following afternoon, I arrived 15 minutes early, not out of nerves, but because I wanted a few moments to myself before the meeting began. We didn't meet at the coffee shop. We met in a small conference room at Daniel's law firm. A closed, quiet space with bright, sterile lighting that left no room for beating around the bush. I sat down, placed my purse on the table, and intertwined my fingers. There was a pitcher of water and 2 bound dossiers already laid out. I didn't open them. I just sat there breathing deeply, centering myself. The door opened. Daniel walked in first, greeting me with a nod followed closely by Jason. Just the two of them. No Allison. I looked at Jason and immediately noticed the toll it had taken on him. His shirt wasn't perfectly pressed. His hair was messy. And his face was visibly haggard. But the biggest change was his eyes. The arrogant confidence was entirely gone, replaced by a tension he couldn't hide. He sat across from me without a word. Daniel took the seat at the head of the table, opening his folder with his usual brisk tone. Let's begin. No one objected. He pushed my draft over to Jason. This is the settlement proposed by Ms. Catherine. You've reviewed it. Jason nodded. Yes, I've read it. And do you have any objections? Jason didn't answer Daniel immediately. He looked at the papers. And then he looked at me. I want to speak directly with you first, he said. I have no objections to that, I replied. He took a deep breath like he was gathering the last of his strength. I can't accept all of your conditions. I know, I said. But those are my conditions. If you strip me of everything, I'll have absolutely nothing left to start over with. I'm not stripping you of anything that's yours, I said slowly. I am only taking back what was always mine. He clenched his jaw. You know that's not what I mean. I know perfectly well what you mean. I stared right back at him. Do you want to keep what you stole? My words hung in the air unanswered. Daniel didn't intervene. He let us talk, only jotting down a few notes on his legal pad. Catherine, Jason continued, dropping his voice. I don't deny that I made a massive mistake. But you should give me an out. I already gave you an out. I replied. I haven't asked for a single penny that isn't backed up by paper trails and proof. But you're including the transfers I made. He stopped as if measuring his words carefully. To Allison. I am including the transfers that came out of our marital joint account. I corrected him. Who you gave the money to is entirely your business. The tension in the room spiked. But it didn't explode. It was like a rope pulled to its absolute limit. Just a millimeter from snapping. Jason leaned back in his chair, stared at the ceiling for a second, and then looked back at me. Do you really feel absolutely nothing for me anymore? He asked. The question didn't surprise me. It was his final desperate attempt to drag me back into the past. Feelings have nothing to do with this, I said. This is purely a matter of what is fair. So if I accept all of this, you'll stop making my life hell. I have never made your life hell. I responded coldly. You did this entirely to yourself. He smiled bitterly. You talk like a lawyer now. I had to learn, I said. A long silence stretched out. Then Daniel stepped in. Let me clarify one point. If an agreement is not reached today, this matter will go to litigation in civil court. In that scenario, the court will review not only the division of assets and financials, but also conduct constituting a breach of fiduciary duties during the marriage. I believe you understand exactly what that entails. Jason didn't look at Daniel. He kept his eyes locked on me. Do you really want to take it to that extreme? He asked. If I have to. I replied without blinking. He nodded slowly as if the reality had finally crushed him. I need time, he said. You've had time. I shot back. Since the day I handed you that draft. I need more, he insisted. At least a week. I didn't answer immediately. I looked at him then. At Daniel. Prolonging this only makes sense if there is a genuine intent to negotiate. Daniel stated. If this is merely a stalling tactic, it's unnecessary. Jason went quiet for a few seconds. I'll sign, he said quietly. But I need to get my finances in order to make the lump sum payments. I looked at him and for the first time I could see he wasn't playing games. 3 days. I said. Not a day more. He looked up. 3 days isn't enough. It's enough. I replied. You already started moving your finances around a long time ago. My words froze him in his chair. I knew he understood exactly what I meant. He had been preparing his exit strategy for months. He just never imagined his exit would look like this. Fine, he said after a long moment. 3 days. Daniel noted it down and nodded. Then we are agreed. In 3 days. Both parties will convene here to execute the final documents. The meeting felt officially over. But Jason didn't stand up. He sat there looking at me with an expression that was hard to decipher. Catherine, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. If none of this had ever happened, do you think things would be different between us? I looked at him. That question wasn't aimed at changing the outcome. It was just him begging for an answer for his own conscience. No, I said. He frowned slightly. Why? Because what happened wasn't some unexpected mistake. I continued. It was the result of a rot that was already there. He didn't say anything else. He stood up, grabbed his copy of the papers, gave Daniel a curt nod, and walked out. When his hand touched the doorknob, he paused for a fraction of a second, but he didn't turn around. The door opened and closed. The conference room fell silent once more. I sat in my chair for a few seconds, then let out a long, shuddering sigh, not out of exhaustion, but because a moment of immense, suffocating tension had finally broken. Daniel closed his dossier. You handled that perfectly. I smiled faintly. I just did what I had to do. He looked at me with a different kind of respect. Not everyone would be capable of that. I didn't reply. I stood up and grabbed my purse. 3 days. I said. Yes, he nodded. I'll have the final execution copies ready. I walked out of the law firm. The late afternoon air was mild. The sun had lost its bite. A light breeze blew down the avenue, carrying that familiar New York mix of exhaust and blooming park trees. I stopped for a moment on the steps, watching the pedestrians rush by. Life kept moving entirely indifferent to anyone's personal tragedies. Deep inside, a very clear sensation began to take shape. It wasn't relief. And it wasn't joy. It was certainty. I was nearing the end of this brutal road. And this time I would cross the finish line entirely on my own 2 feet. 3 days later. I didn't arrive early. And I didn't arrive late. I arrived exactly on time. Maintaining the exact same precision, sufficiency, and lack of excess I had carried through my 3 years of marriage. Daniel's office looked identical to the last time. The small conference room. The long mahogany table. The harsh white lighting. Nothing to distract from the reality of the moment. Everything was direct. Just like what was about to happen. Daniel was already there. When he saw me walk in, he greeted me with a brief nod. On the table, 2 identical sets of documents were laid out. One for each of us. Perfectly stapled and flagged with "Sign Here" stickers. Jason arrived about 2 minutes later. He walked in without scanning the room, barely offering a greeting. His eyes brushed past me for a fraction of a second before locking onto the dossier in front of him. The last 3 days clearly hadn't been kind to him. His face was paler, his eyes more hollowed out. But this time there was no fight left in his gaze. Only a hollowed-out acceptance. He sat down. No one spoke immediately. The room didn't feel like a pressure cooker anymore. It felt somber. Like the dead calm that rolls in after a catastrophic storm. Daniel broke the silence. Today, we will proceed with the signing of the divorce settlement agreement as previously negotiated. I must remind both parties that upon execution, all clauses will become legally binding. Please review the documents one final time. Jason nodded. I did the same. Daniel opened the folders and slid a copy to each of us. I turned the pages even though I had read them 100 times before. The lines of black ink. The crystal clear clauses. Stripped of all emotion or memory. Just hard boundaries. The Upper West Side apartment was legally mine. Jason was legally obligated to wire back the portion of the SUV down payment taken from the joint account. The money transfers were thoroughly documented and had to be repaid in specific installments. No joint children. No further liabilities. No remaining ties. I stopped at the final page. The signature line was waiting blank. I set my pen down on the table without signing it yet. I looked up. Jason was also staring at the last page. His hand gripping a pen but hovering over the paper without moving. A heavy silence stretched out. No one rushed him. Finally, it was Jason who spoke first. "Catherine," he said, looking up at me, "when we sign this, it's really over, isn't it?" The question no longer carried a pleading tone. It was more of a final confirmation, a verbal processing of the reality that was crashing down on him. "Yes," I answered. He gave a tiny nod. "I never thought this day would actually come," he said, his voice rough. "Neither did I," I replied. He managed a barely there smile. 3 years went by really fast. I didn't say anything. To me those 3 years hadn't been fast or slow. They had been a road with enough good parts to keep me walking and enough cracks to eventually break my ankles. I always thought that no matter what happened you'd be the one who stayed until the bitter end. He continued. "I thought so too," I said. My answer shut him down. He stared at me for a moment longer then dropped his gaze to the paper. "I'm sorry," he said. This time it wasn't a rushed panicked apology to save his own skin. It was slow, clear and loaded with the gravity of absolute defeat. I heard him but I didn't answer right away. There are apologies that arrive entirely too late. Not because they lack meaning but because they no longer possess the power to change a single thing. "I heard you," I said. Just that. No lingering resentments. No grand absolutions. Just a receipt of delivery. He nodded as if he understood exactly what that meant and brought his pen down to the paper. In the exact moment the tip touched the line I saw his hand hesitate an almost invisible tremor but it was there. Then he signed. His name appeared on the paper in that familiar handwriting I had seen on so many leases, utility bills and even old birthday cards. This time it was sitting in a very different place. A place of closure. He set the pen down and Daniel turned to me. "Miss Catherine." I nodded, picked up my pen. My hand wasn't shaking. I looked at the blank line and wrote my name. Catherine. My handwriting was exactly the same as always. It hadn't changed. The only difference was that the woman holding the pen was no longer the same woman from 3 years ago. When I put the pen down, I didn't feel the crushing pain I had always anticipated. There wasn't a single second where my heart contracted in grief. There was only one blazing, undeniably clear sensation. It's over. Daniel collected both copies, reviewed the signatures one last time and stamped them with his notary seal. With this, everything is finalized, he stated. There was no applause, no congratulations, no formal ceremony, just a dry, simple sentence. But it was enough to officially bury a marriage. Jason stood up first. He didn't look at me right away. He adjusted his collar out of sheer nervous habit, then turned toward the door. "I'm leaving," he said. I nodded. There was no handshake, no final hug, no tearful goodbye. He turned his back and walked out the door. This time, he didn't stop in the doorway. The heavy door swung open and clicked shut. I stayed in my chair for a few extra seconds, staring at the empty space across the table. There was no one on the other side anymore. There was absolutely nothing left to say. Daniel gathered the executed documents and slipped them into his briefcase. "Do you need me to call you a car to get home?" "No need," I said. "I can go on my own." He nodded. "If you need anything else going forward, please don't hesitate to reach out." "I will." I stood up, grabbed my purse, and walked out of the conference room. The hallway outside felt blindingly bright. The natural sunlight pouring through the large glass panes made everything look sharper, cleaner. I walked slowly, taking my time. When I reached the main lobby doors of the building, I stopped for a moment, not because I was afraid to keep going, but because I wanted to cement that exact instant in my memory. A long, exhausting road had finally come to an end. No turning back. No regrets. There was only the future left. I walked down the concrete steps. The wind blew softly against my face. The city of New York was exactly the same. The cabs, the sirens, the people. It all kept flowing. I was the only thing that was different. I didn't go straight to the apartment. I walked aimlessly for a while, just letting my body get used to the sensation of the void. I ducked into a small, quiet coffee shop, ordered an iced tea, and sat alone by the window, watching the crowds blur past. Suddenly, it hit me. I longer felt abandoned. Before all of this, I used to think that if I lost someone, I would lose everything. But now I understood that there are certain things in life that only truly belong to you once you have the guts to let go of what no longer deserves you. I pulled out my phone and texted my mom. "It's done, Mom." She replied almost instantly. "Good. Come home for a few days, sweetheart." I stared at the glowing screen and smiled faintly. "I'm on my way." I locked my phone and took a sip of the tea. It was a little bitter at first, but it left a sweet aftertaste. Kind of like everything I had just survived. Allison hadn't stolen my husband. She had merely taken away a man who in reality no longer belonged to me anyway. And what I had successfully managed to keep wasn't a bank account, a piece of real estate, or a corporate title. It was myself. A woman who had navigated a catastrophic betrayal without losing her fundamental worth. A woman who knew exactly when to pull the ripcord, and who knew how to start completely over without needing anyone else to draw the map for her. I took a deep breath, feeling the crisp morning air fill my lungs, and stepped back out onto the sidewalk. Life was moving forward, and this time I was walking right along with it without ever looking back.